All right, today we're going into the third limb of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which is about asana. And asana is literally translated as stance. This is the fundamental dynamic of Hatha Yoga, or at least how it is popularized. In this video, we're going to talk about a single stance, however, but we're not going to focus on the mechanics of that stance. For this, I give you 4 links below that fully describe the stance called Wuji, and it is from Qigong. It is the fundamental stance of Qigong, and it is something that encompasses the whole philosophy of what we're talking about, especially in this third limb. Now, let me refer back to the Yoga Sutras themselves, and they tell us for this limb that the stance, the asana, is one of unwavering joy, which is fulfilled by this Wuji stance once you master it. But it's so simple, it's basically standing up, and you don't need to move and you don't need to stretch. The whole point of Wuji is relaxation, but it's a dynamic relaxation because it stimulates the energy to move in the body, and hence it initiates the 4th limb of yoga, which is about energy work called pranayama, or breath work. So the Yoga Sutras continue to say that this position that we're talking about, which can also be called a seat or your standing place, and it results from the integration of all-pervading relaxation and fully committed effort. Now, the word Wuji means the dynamic of nothingness, or an emptiness dynamic. You don't do anything, but within that non-doing is the fullness of potential energy, you might say. And this potential energy actually gets the body's internal processes moving, these subtle processes, and it assists in all of the practices that we've done up to date. The point is that every limb of yoga that I'm describing here from the sutras is an accumulation of all the previous. It is a consequence, but also it sums them all up. So you do everything before, and then it comes into culmination with this one. And then you do everything before, including this one, and then it naturally leads to energy work. One thing flows into another. When you get the sequence of practices in such a way that you can perceive this, that one thing flows into another, then you know you're on the right track. So this stance is supposed to establish a liberation and immunity from polarizing duality. And that's important, and I'm going to emphasize it because it's described in the sutras in the earlier part of the 2nd chapter before the author gets into the actual 8 processes. Now, again, there's a lot to be said about Wuji, and I'm not going to get into it because it's technically not part of the sutras. However, within I gave these 4 links because they kind of address different aspects of this. There's different people describe it slightly differently. Some people emphasize esoteric aspects, some people simplify it, and the first link is very, very simplified. Plus, if you do a Wuji search yourself, just say Wuji stance, Wuji, you will find many, many videos that demonstrate this. And it's very, very simple, but like one of the commentators says here, you can spend your whole life perfecting it. And it's the stance where you begin all Qigong and Tai Chi movements and you end them. It begins and ends with this. So if you can practice yoga with this, then you're actually moving into potentially practicing Tai Chi and Qigong in a much easier manner because the mind will be fully immersed in it. The issue is we want to establish immunity from polarizing duality. Now, Hatha Yoga stretches do this, but that requires an extreme commitment. And usually people begin with these and then move and try to master something like meditation as they're doing it. Whereas there's a whole set of preliminaries to train the mind to be able to decondition to a certain extent and reach a state of internalization alchemy. So when you reach the point of actually doing a physical stance and a mental stance at the same time, the two combine and the physical stance becomes an engine for your practice. It puts the body more directly into it so your practice is grounded. Thus, you're not going to space out. You're not going to become unconscious or move into a trance state. Sometimes that's desired, but in order to engage in life with this, in order to actually become empowered within life, this physical appropriation is a boon, if not absolutely necessary, and it is to some point. But I've simplified. I found that this Wuji stance sums up everything. So no matter what else you want to do, even if you do practice Hatha Yoga stretches and postures, this is highly recommended. Because if you can master meditation in this, and you don't have to sit in lotus posture and in any kind of discomfort, you're actually standing up, which many say is much healthier than sitting down. It moves your muscles into a state of absolute receptivity to the energies of earth and sky and the environs. So let me get into what this immunity from polarizing duality is. Now, Patanjali goes and makes a discussion here about a subject known as entanglement, which is a translation of the term samyoga, which can mean confusion. And what it means is basically the entanglement is between the subject and the object of perception. Now, as I quote from my own translation, the object of perception is the meaning of the gift of worldly experience. I mean, it's necessary. This experience is made up of the power of being, of your sensory power of being, to sustain the enduring nature of manifest activity. So in order to operate in the world, you need the objects. I mean, we're not going into full internalization and rejecting the world here. We're not going into solipsism either, where we say, I am the only one, only the subject exists. The object is distinguished from the subject for a reason, in order so we can operate in physical and metaphysical reality, because the ultimate state of spiritual union is pinnacle, and the mountain isn't just the peak. The strength of the mountain is in the base, in the middle, in the whole thing. Now, categories of things are indistinct measures of specific and non-specific evidences, which means that the mind is actually moving through its own programming, which can have a biological basis to keep us in survival mode, as well as a social basis of conditioning. And the mind creates this separation between object and subject. Something is acting upon us. Not only that, but we have this hyper focus on our first person presence. I am, the I thing. And maybe people think that should be abandoned, but that's not true either, in my honest opinion, and I don't think that's what the sutras say either. In fact, the subject, it says, has the full measure of perception power. Now, the sense of awareness feedback through this perception power is genuine. The object is actually giving you something. It is communicating with you. And so the substance of this communication is truly the in itself essence of the object of perception. The world isn't an illusion. It's just that when you project upon the object as something separate, then it becomes illusionary, because you are projecting qualities without even realizing it consciously. The object of perception has an essence, and this essence is deep within the subject and is realized by the subject, and the two are one within the subject. Physiologically speaking, every perception occurs within the body-mind. So the world is actually the response of the body-mind to whatever the connection is. And in reality, we have the object and the subject, which is us, and the act of perception itself. This relationship is, as I said in the previous video, is indistinguishable. It's a continuity. Since the subject and the object sustain a common reality frame, you don't separate from the world, you separate from the programming. So as long as you're interacting in terms of the programming as the reality, then no matter how much you progress, your progression is still partial. And the stance helps you maintain your own presence within the world. So the subject becomes empowered, it doesn't become disempowered. Now, this entanglement, this conceptual entanglement, which is a mind thing, and the body follows the mind, is the reason to actualize our nature from a position of power and self-ownership. Now, that's a quote. The problem is that we lack discernment because of programming, because of repression, because of many states where our mind is not evolved to its fullest potential. It's still an incomplete dynamic, evolutionary speaking. It's evolved to adapt to the world, and the closest adaptation is one of separation, and it's one of fragmentation, and it's one of survival orientation. And this is a self-fulfilling prophecy because we don't have the resources to transcend it. But to transcend it, we need to release this, what I translate as folly. Folly is technically from the Sanskrit word avidya, which really means lack of vision or ignorance. But this isn't a conventional meaning of ignorance. It's actually a form of mental compromise. It's a form of not being able to perceive and discern what's really going on. When you dissolve this, you also dissolve entanglement. Because if you can actually perceive what's going on by opening these pathways of perception, I'm talking about essence perception, not just the sensory pathways, you will destroy the perception binding power of your folly, of an immature mind state that inhibits you from perceiving the world as it is. Now, this isn't some big dramatic thing. It begins in very subtle ways, perceiving the world as it is, because you start perceiving internal causality within your objective reality that you didn't perceive before. Your mind computes things differently. It's not a mystical state per se. It's a state of mental enhancement, but this is not the cognitive mind. This also relates to the mind of the cells, to the peripheral nervous system, to the essence of the body, and even your DNA. It goes down to the very subquantum level of your being. The whole body-mind is, in essence, an organ of perception. The point here is, when you maintain the proper stance, you're aligned with the ethical dynamics, which support your integrity so you don't accidentally or purposely, in order to stop cognitive dissonance which may arise, in order to stop obsessions, because obsessions are like mental parasites. A parasite will alter your internal stimuli, even your behavior, in order to keep itself fed. If you start eating, like I had said, a decent diet that the parasite doesn't like, because let's say it likes to eat sugars, the parasite will stimulate you in such a way that you crave sugars because it wants to be fed. And you can't distinguish between the parasite doing it and your actual need for sugars, for example, because, some say, well, in some cases, yeah, the body does need sugars in some way, but it doesn't need refined sugars and snacks and processed sugars. This is similar to the avidya state that yoga talks about, because you can't tell the difference in the subject-object perception. Things get entangled. I am at the mercy of the world. I am at the mercy of objective reality, or I am an objective being that just happens to perceive myself subjectively. And this creates a defense mechanism, which is natural, because you're backed into the corner of your own subjectivity. Your own subjectivity is marginalized, so you need to compensate. And then the ego comes in and does a whole bunch of stuff in order to provide compensation. It promises, well, you can stand in the world, you can be somebody, you need to reinforce this. And you're projecting that into the world, and then you corrupt the in-between state, which is the action, which is the verb. So anything that happens that connects you and the world to you is corrupted by your defensiveness with a whole bunch of obsessions, and it's corrupted by the misapprehension of the world itself. That doesn't mean the world is a concealed paradise and you're just misperceiving all the conflicts. Everything can be absolutely real, but it's corrupted and twisted through programming. And notice we're not blaming this on anything, because the causality can be best addressed from a position of empowerment, which means that, well, the ball's in our court all the time. When I'm playing racquetball and there's a wall, I don't blame the wall for sending the ball in a direction I can't reach. The ball is always caused by what I do with the racket. However, the wall has its own nature. And this gets complex with the real world, so to speak, of objects or environment, or it can be other people, it can be anything. So when I say object, I don't mean a dead thing or an item like a box or a ball or something like that, or a rock. This is essentially anything that is in the world. And when you expand your being and connect to the world more deeply, you're connecting to the true essence of what the world is. You don't seek to become one with it as a different thing. That oneness occurs, but it's not a meshing. It's a beautiful, complex tapestry that may sound distorted, may be experienced distorted, like nails on a chalkboard even, and there you have suffering. However, when you change your perception into something more resourceful because it's more true, you can do something about it. Oh, what? Tell me what to do. That's not necessary. Instead of telling you what to do, because each person is different and each case is different and each objective perception is different. What I believe, and not just me, but apparently, many mystics, is that if you become empowered through the truth of reality and the awakening of your own true discernment, your own natural healthy discernment, because I'm not going to use the word perfect here. This is essentially a healthy natural state. So it's good enough. And because everything is dynamic, this state can be evolving, so it can get better. But you're here to reach a basis. Your stance is a basis. And you've been able to ideally understand and are still working through the internalization alchemy dynamics. So your internal world is on the right track. Even though you're technically not meditating yet, and you haven't even started deliberate energy work, you're setting the stage and you may experience spontaneous energy dynamics. There's a state that's somewhere in between emotions, in between sensations, and in between thoughts. And all of these mesh into a kind of true synesthesia. Not where you listen to what you see, not sensory synesthesia. This is experiential synesthesia. That's the state of the subtle body. Well, the subtle body is me. It extends into the world, but it's like my arm extending into the world. So you can withdraw your subjective self and say, I'm not the body, I'm not this, I'm not that. Then you end up with, what am I? What am I is pure consciousness. But pure consciousness is the pure subject, and we are not just the pure subject. What alchemy does and what yoga does, this harnessing, is it expands our very definition of what we are and what the world is as a single dynamic. What self is. So self is not the first person pronoun, and we don't have enough words in the dictionary to distinguish these things as special cases. Your I am sense, your first person pronoun, it generates an ego because it's insulated from the rest. You really don't need an ego, which is a program. What you need and have is a personality, which is an accumulation of all of your predispositions and experiences. And what maintains the personality is the definition of the shadow. And this shadow is not supposed to have a malignant presence within it. It's meant to be an outline. And it's an outline of your territory of subjectivity. So nothing is within the shadow, but the outline of the shadow, where it touches everything else, including your true self, gives you a sense of reference from which your centered being, your soul, can operate and relate to both itself and the world and all of the actions occurring and relations in between, because all action is relation. It ties one thing to another. So when you have a perfected stance, it's a statement. You're stating and affirming with all of your being that you are beyond these separations. Distinction is one thing, saying my right hand is distinct from my left hand. But if I say they're separated from me, then who's calling the shots of where the right hand goes and where the left hand goes and stuff? If it's not me, what is it? And then you're projecting your power onto something else. And that is the big problem with normal perception, so to speak, or conventional perception. We are projecting our empowerment, our true power, which is the power of awareness. And when I say awareness, I include consciousness, which is mind subject awareness, and experience, the awareness of the world, and sentience, which is an awareness that goes even deeper from instinct and body awareness and body perception to higher intuition. Again, all of these things are awareness, and some people may use the word consciousness for it interchangeably, but because there are variations, it helps to be able to tell the difference. There are differences. Difference doesn't mean disconnection, because disconnection is equal to alienation. And alienation generates aggressive oppositions, not polarity where you have a current moving as through a battery, but contradiction, where things are antagonistic. An antagonism, as opposed to what you might call benign competition, or any kind of competition where you're not technically, in my book, true competition isn't working against others. It's improving yourself, and others may be a reference frame. So you have a reference frame where humanity is and where the average person is, and you're saying, well, that's not good enough for me. I don't want to be the average, because the average is evolving and it's in its own zone, but I require greater resourcefulness, greater empowerment. I require suffering to decrease to the point where I realize it's absolutely unnecessary. Even if there are life lessons to learn, they don't need to involve suffering. That's a decision that when you commence with internal transformation, with internal alchemy, you may have a talk with yourself and say, okay, am I ready to transcend suffering? Do I think that suffering is necessary in order to evolve in life? Can I do it? Will I become a lazy nothing, inert, if I don't have suffering? Which is essentially telling yourself you're like a horse drawing a carriage that doesn't want to really go anywhere. If you don't whip it, it won't move. And if you don't need to whip it, you'll at least have to train it, meaning program it. We human beings cannot even help ourselves, let alone help the world, unless we are free from this. We do not need to be harnessed. We are harnessing our being. Our being is harnessing itself. So the true nature of harnessing is no harnessing. The true nature of causality is being released from causality and just letting things go, which means you don't identify causality as a force separate from you. Now, that's an extreme zone if you're a religious person, and it's dangerous to actually think that way when your ego is still prominent as a representation of programming, conditioning, even instinctive patterns, traumas, obsessions due to alienation and prior suffering. All of these things are being addressed, and we're whittling it down. We're whittling all of these corrupt sources of friction down so we can become more clear without becoming even more alienated, because you can reach a point of clarity that's based on denial. You deny everything, there's nothing left, so you're free. That's not what the void in this sense is. In this sense, the Wu Ji posture is giving the body an experience of its own original state. An original state from which all states emerge. So it is a state of pure potential, and that's what we're reaching. When we reach a state of pure potential, where we're acting as a form of non-action, so things happen, and we do, but there is no programmed initiative. So doing is an organic dynamic. It's far more pleasant, meaningful, healthier. You're not just giving up. You still have initiative, but your initiative is natural because a true circulation with the world means that you're not entangled. If you entangle your blood vessels, the blood's not going to flow. You're going to die. If you entangle any cell and squeeze it and twist it, nothing can flow. Then the current, if it flows even a little bit, it's going to have high resistance. And high resistance creates heat, and heat will burn. This is a metaphor. I'm not demonizing heat. And many people, when they do focus within, they feel an internal heat, and that can be a good thing. It means you're working through resistance. So I will conclude here. If you're really interested in deeper metaphysical viewpoints, which merge the traditional and even the introductory with cutting-edge metaphysics, and many of these things are expressed in such a way through the traditional writings and oral teaching, so to speak, in order for a little bit of experience. Once you verify it, you have a foundation, a basis, and you stand on that, like asana. And you stand on that, you can move to the next position. You can move to the next action because you are on firm ground. That creates a new ground. So every step of harnessing, every step of yoga is the creation of a new stance. We can call all of the limbs stances. We can call all of the limbs internalization alchemy because that's what they are. As you move through this and begin to understand it because you're disentangling, your perception begins disentangling, and it's not a dramatic thing. You can have a split second of revelation of this, but that split second does not go away. It becomes a new step on the path. And as the Taoists like to say, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. But every step is a first step because it takes you into new territory. And next week, we're going to go into energy work, breath work, and this vitality or life force that's generated through the breath specifically. If you're interested in essays on metaphysics, go to my Substack at acgeorge.substack.com. Please look at these links in order to get an idea of what this Wuji is. If you want to do a practice, please do this. It is very simple, deceptively simple, and it is relaxing and can help. So as you do all the previous, try to go back into the internalization practices and do them in a standing posture like that. One of the links has additional postures, and they're all standing types. I'm just giving you certain foundations because the Yoga Sutras are an ideal place to start with all other metaphysical practices. Thank you again for listening, and if you're interested in a process of actual occult transformation, that's pretty gradual, but it's real time. And at this point, it has to do with dream interpretation, but we're also transcending that. We're moving into even more advanced states. These dreams are penetrations into the karma of a guest of mine, Jay. It's a lot of personal stuff, and I thank Jay for transmitting all of this. So without further ado, thank you for listening. Magus out.